JFK files have officially been declassified, and the CIA's alleged involvement and subsequent cover-up has them being viewed as one of the most evil organizations in the history of the United States. And we'll even hear JFK's nephew, RFK, talk about why the CIA seemingly hated JFK so much.
I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
JFK was the last president to get assassinated, but the details around it have always been questioned. Not only by people who are dismissed as conspiracy theorists, it's been questioned in major Hollywood movies like Oliver Stone's JFK, specifically around the details regarding how many people were involved in the actual incident. Was there a cover-up? And was there even something more sinister at play that caused all of this? And emphasizing the reality that the world is actually much more darker than we ever could have imagined. But before we get into that, guys, my name is Ruslan. This channel exists to encourage, empower, and inspire you to live a life that blesses God. Oftentimes, that requires us taking a sober look at the reality of human nature when it's left to its own devices and detached from God. So, if you're new here, or if you're not new here, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. There's a huge percentage of people who watch this channel, unfortunately, are not subscribed. All right, let's jump into this video. So there's been a ton of documents released, and it's going to take a while for people to comb through every single one. But the most shocking thing that I've been able to personally come across is this document about a gentleman named Gary Underhill. All right, and this gentleman is alleged to have been connected to the CIA, and the day after the situation with JFK happened, it says that he left Washington in a hurry. Late in the evening, he showed up at the home of friends in New Jersey. He was very agitated. A small clique within the CIA was responsible for the, according to him, he confided, and he was afraid for his life and probably would have to leave the country. Less than 6 months later, Underhill was found deleted to death in his Washington apartment. The coroner ruled this a self-deletion. The controversial part is not that he said this and then died, it's how he died. The detail that's disturbing about this is even though this was ruled a self-deletion, he passed of a gunshot wound behind his ear. That's right, this gentleman self-deleted himself by positioning the firearm back here. Seems a bit odd. Now, if a sketchy self-deletion sounds familiar, it's because this sort of stuff has happened before. Outside of the obvious Epstein files and some other things that have happened, this directly reminded me of a situation with a gentleman named Gary Webb, who also blew the whistle on the CIA in the 80s and early 90s because he alleged that they were allowing cheap to flood American streets so that they could fight the communists in Nicaragua. And if you don't believe me, listen to this documentary that Vice put together around the details surrounding his death.
Webb and the San Jose Mercury News often maintain that Dark Alliance was intended as the beginning of an investigation that larger newspapers with more resources could then continue. But what actually happened was that instead of investigating the CIA, major papers like the LA Times, Washington Post, and New York Times all attacked Webb himself. Webb was eventually hounded from his job and found himself unable to work as a journalist. He died by suicide in 2004.
So instead of his groundbreaking story making waves within the news cycle, he was ousted of a job and tragically passed. And the shocking part about that is the details around his alleged self-deletion. He was twice in the face. This was covered by multiple media sources at the time of his death, including the LA Times, but this article clearly says that Webb deleted himself with 2 shots to the head. So needless to say, this will lead many to believe that the Gary Underhill report from the JFK declassified files is likely true. But why would our own CIA want JFK taken out? Well, interestingly enough, RFK, JFK's nephew, actually answers this when he was on Joe Rogan's podcast.
My uncle, John Kennedy, did that. He refused to go to war. So he was surrounded by military-industrial complex and he learned very early and an intelligence apparatus that he realized early on that the purpose of the CIA and the intelligence apparatus was to create a constant pipeline of new wars for the military-industrial complex.
Why would the military-industrial complex have an axe to grind? Well, the military accounts for around $1 trillion, upwards of $1 trillion of our budget today. And much of that, people would argue, is bureaucratic waste in ways, meaning that it's not just going to soldiers' salaries and making sure veterans are taken care of. Oftentimes, that goes to $300 toilet seats, which was a real story that was covered. And so there's already some bureaucracy built in. The military-industrial complex is all the private companies, American private companies, that make weapons for the military when there's war. So if there are constant wars, these private American companies end up making money because they have to make more and more weapons for the military. And oddly enough, those are probably being spent at a surplus, meaning that they're probably paying really good money for these American companies to make said American weapons.
And 2 months later, the military and intelligence came to him and said, we got to invade Cuba. And he was like, I'm not going to Cuba, and I'm not going to let the military. And they said, well, we got all these Cubans trained, and they're going to go attack Castro. And he said, well, we can't, the U.S. government can't be doing that. We can't be attacking. I don't like what Castro's doing down there, but it's not the United States' job to dictate what kind of governments other countries have. We're not going to do it. And he stepped out of that meeting, and he realized they had been lying to him and trying to trick him. And he said, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
JFK, according to RFK, wanted to get rid of the CIA. The CIA is an agency with a ton of power, and they're there to provide intelligence. They're basically spies. So they're working with covert agents, they're getting information, and they're feeding it back to the government in terms of how they should deal with other foreign actors. So that still raises the question, why would JFK want to dismantle the CIA? Well, John Harris, oddly enough, did a video explaining and exploring some of these reasons.
This cover and deception plan to make attacks on American targets, fake attacks that will be blamed on Cuba to raise tensions between the US and Cuba to justify an invasion, a legitimate provocation as the basis for a US military intervention in Cuba.
Them wanting to go to war with Cuba wasn't just financially motivated to prop up the military-industrial complex and boost the economy. I'm sure there were some people that probably felt that way, and maybe even some people who had some investments in these American companies that made weapons. But there are also people who were driven strictly by an ideology that because Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was communist, and America was capitalist, that this was an extension of the Cold War, and they felt uncomfortable with the Soviet Union having any type of influence over Cuba, considering that Cuba is like 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So it's fairly close proximity-wise. So many of those folks were probably ideologically driven to have control over Cuba and to bring democracy there, that it wasn't all just sinister motives. Those folks might have legitimately believed that, hey, this is not good for America. However, that doesn't justify false flags and operations to blame Cuba for stuff they didn't do. That is the really dark conclusions of a very pragmatic worldview where the ends justify the means by any means. So whatever you want to do, you just reverse engineer, even if you're lying and doing unethical stuff that's putting blame on people that had nothing to do with it. This is wrong, especially as a Christian. You can't think like this around these sorts of topics.
Starts with the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, where they would start rumors using fake radio stations and get American-friendly locals to stage fake attacks on the base, starting riots in the surrounding area. Another proposed part of the plan was to blow up a U.S. ship and blame it on Cuba. This was specifically called out as a, quote, remember the Maine incident. The document predicts that the newspapers would start reporting on the casualties, causing a helpful wave of national indignation. They also wanted to create a fake terrorist campaign on American soil in Miami or Washington. They wanted to sink boats of Cuban refugees and stage the shooting of refugee targets, and even suggested exploding a few plastic bombs in American cities. These weren't all going to be pretend. They even say in the document that they would go to the extent of wounding people and then making fake arrests with prepared documents so it could all be widely publicized, making Cuba look like an irresponsible government.
So now, fast forward, they released the JFK files, and there seems to have been some sort of armed incident at the CIA headquarters that just happened.
Okay, welcome back. Looks like activity. We don't have a lot of details. We're showing you a live shot of the headquarters of Central Intelligence in Langley, Virginia. That's in Northern Virginia. It looks like a police presence. There's some barricade up.
Now, this is horrifying if this is real, but some are even starting to allege that perhaps this is a staged incident to prevent them from releasing other classified documents in the future. Now, the unfortunate thing about a situation like this is people are always trying to disperse blame. You'll see a lot of stuff trending on the internet with connections to Israel and Israel's deep state being secretly behind the JFK situation. The sad part about this is folks will ignore all the other references to the other country in this document that was released today. Over 200 references to the Soviet Union, 50 to 100 references to Cuba, and 10 to 20 references to everybody, including our allies like France, the United Kingdom, and West Germany. The human brain is always trying to make sense of the unthinkable. In a situation like this, we see a president who was executed and it was caught on camera. And so we're trying to make sense of who's secretly behind this and what operation is doing this. And right now, it's a popular time to hate on Israel, if we're honest. Now, that's not an endorsement or a dismissal of some of the issues happening in the Middle East. But I think the point of all of this is not to try and find someone to put the blame on. I think the point in all this is to see a situation like this as a mirror to the state of humanity. We see this in Romans chapter 2, verse 21, where it states, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened." So Paul is writing the church in Rome, and he's describing a lot of the issues that are happening within their own culture, within the Roman way of living. So these sorts of situations are not new. They're as old as civilization and time itself. Verse 22, "Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles." This is specifically talking about idolatry. It's specifically talking about making idols. But I think we often make idols out of things like power, status, influence, pride, and if someone is aspiring to grab power within an institution like the CIA, and I'm not saying everyone that's ever worked for the CIA is an idolater and evil, but there is a desire for status and power. Oftentimes they can make idols out of those things, and though they're not little statues that they're making and they're lighting incense and putting food to, I like how we would visualize most folks who worship idols. The reality is that status and power and conquest definitely is an idol for many people who are aspiring for these things. Therefore, God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. It's always interesting that when you go deep enough with people who have power, they always have some bizarre perversion involving the human body, isn't it? Whether it's the Epstein situation or just a typical person that's working in Wall Street and is wilding out and hookers and that sort of stuff. It's always connected when there's power and status involved to some degree of perversion when it comes to sexuality. I wonder why that is. Is it perhaps because God designed us to function a specific way and that marriage in its proper context is how society and civilizations are built and meant to thrive instead of trying to take power and conquer others? I think there's something to all that. I think idolatry and perversion seem to go hand in hand. But I'm glad that these things are coming out. And I'm curious what else is going to come out. Are we going to see the Epstein files? Is there going to be more details released around this as people go through these documents? And what ultimately is going to be discovered when you consider how dark the human heart can be when God is removed from the picture? But I don't think it's all bad and hopeless. Actually, around the same time that JFK is dealing with some of this stuff, another person is rising to prominence. And I think 80 plus years later, Billy Graham's plan is starting to finally make sense. I talk about just that when I spoke at Apologetics Canada with my friend Wes Huff. You can check that out over here. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.